Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. If you can see this, hear this, or read this, then maybe you'll believe it. If not, well, consider this my last confession, or the final record of what really happened at the FEMA Biological Research Facility hidden just a few hours southwest of Salt Lake City. There's no official name for the site anymore. All references have been scrubbed. But I remember the sign at the front gate. Project Anstead. Authorized personnel only. I got the job through a friend of a friend. I was an independent security contractor who previously worked small contracts overseas, mostly in places that never made the news. My formal training was modest. I was in the Army Reserve straight out of high school, stationed briefly at Fort Benning, then spent a short stint in law enforcement before trying my luck with private security. Freelance work let me dodge the rigid structure I'd never really enjoyed. I had no illusions about changing the world. I just needed a decent paycheck. After all, my younger brother, Jaden, was saving for college, and I was the only one in the family with a consistent income. That's how I ended up in rural Utah, signing non-disclosure agreements about a specialized FEMA site dedicated to disease research. They never used the word virus, but you could see it in the cautious tone of the facility's administrators. They'd say pathogenic study or environmental hazard evaluation, dancing around the truth. The place was located down a dirt access road that branched off from Route 89, with a couple of huge metal gates and an automatic scanning system. The official cover was that this compound was an environmental containment unit, a station where top-secret tests were carried out in the name of national security. When I first arrived, it seemed like any high-security research center. Chain-link fences topped with barbed wire, a guard station with rotating shifts, and an underground bunker area accessible only through locked blast doors. A series of thick, reinforced doors led downward to what I was told was a data repository. The staff wore FEMA badges, but there were also folks from the CDC, some from the private sector, and a handful of uniformed soldiers who never talked about their branch. The corridors were painted white and lined with bright fluorescent lights. Signage carried coded labels: Containment Wing, A2, Laboratory L3, Observation Wing, and so on. I remember the first day vividly. 2 scientists in clean room suits shuffled by, whispering about something called a reanimation protocol. I tried not to eavesdrop, but it was hard not to notice the tension in their eyes. My immediate supervisor was a tall, serious man named John Alvarez. He had come from a Homeland Security background. His instructions were straightforward. Stay at your post, follow the shift schedule, don't ask questions. I did just that. For the first few days, it was downright boring. I sat at a security desk near one of the lower-level entrances, checking staff IDs, scanning deliveries, and reading paperback novels to pass the hours. But you could sense the hush around the place. Scientists wore looks that spoke of things they wished they could forget. Personnel whispered about Project Host and Subject M variants. A few folks in the cafeteria used the term H-types, though no one would define it clearly. Rumors spread about unusual tests on lab animals, but the descriptions of these lab animals never made sense. Someone said they looked too human-like. I tried not to think about it. The pay was good, and I was told it was necessary to keep America safe from possible chemical or biological threats. But every time I escorted the nighttime cleaning staff to certain wings, I saw locked rooms with frosted windows. I never knew exactly what was on the other side. Tension started to build on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when we got word a massive storm front was heading across the region. High winds, thunder, and the kind of sideways rain that can flood entire roads. By evening, the power in the facility was flickering. The backup generators were tested monthly, but this was the real deal. Half the employees were sure we'd lose main power. That's when Alvarez gathered the security team, 8 of us in total, for a briefing. This is a Category 4 storm system. There's a high probability we'll be on backup power by nightfall. Ensure all lockdown protocols are working. If the main feed drops, those blast doors in the lower levels need to stay sealed. He paused and tapped a clipboard. And keep an eye on the quiet wings. If you see something that doesn't look standard, report it immediately. No exceptions. An hour later, the facility lights flickered, and a distant rumble echoed through the corridors. I checked my watch. 8:13 p.m. The overhead speakers crackled to life. All non-essential personnel, report to the main lobby for further instructions. I took my usual post near the corridor that led to the lower labs. This corridor was lined with reinforced steel on both sides. At the far end was a thick vault-like door, labeled restricted, level 4 access only. Honestly, I was just counting the minutes until my shift ended. The hum of overhead lights made the silence even heavier. Then it happened. The entire building went dark for 3 seconds. After that, the emergency lights kicked in, bathing the corridor in red. Somewhere far off, I heard a high-pitched klaxon, then the robotic voice from the overhead PA system. Warning, backup power engaged. Facility in lockdown. Repeat, facility in lockdown. My radio crackled as Alvarez's voice came through. Dan, are you at Corridor C near the sub-level door? Over. I pressed the talk button. Yes. Lights are on emergency mode. The blast door is still locked. I'm standing by. A pause. Static. And then... Maintain position. We've got a situation with the generator. Keep eyes open for any forced access. The line went silent. I stood near that massive door for at least half an hour. My only company was the red glow of the emergency lights. The overhead vents made soft hissing sounds as the airflow system struggled on limited power. At times, I thought I heard faint thumps from behind the door, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Outside, the storm pounded the desert. The wind would pick up, then die, then roar again. I had my sidearm, a standard issue 9mm, holstered at my waist, but it gave me little comfort. Every now and then, my radio spat out updates from other guards, talk of strange noises, flickering lights in the labs, or missing staff members. The word missing caught my attention. Then I heard someone mention the phrase, "They're out," and the radio went silent again. I tried responding, but all I got was static. That's when the building's entire system surged. The overhead lights turned bright white for 2 seconds, then blinked out completely, and the red emergency lights died with a pop. Utter darkness for a moment. My eyes struggled to adjust. And then the blast door hissed. I swung my flashlight to see if it was unlocking. On the control panel, the lights blinked erratically. The hydraulics that kept the door sealed made a grinding noise. Inside the door mechanism, something was malfunctioning under the strain. Then, with a metallic groan, the entire sealed door slid open about a foot, just enough space for me to peer into the gloom beyond. My flashlight revealed a hallway with strobing emergency lights. Boxes were toppled, no sign of movement. I radioed Alvarez, but only static, so I did what protocol demanded. I tried to reset the door lock. The panel was unresponsive, likely shorted out from the surge. Without comms, I couldn't be sure if I was supposed to reseal the door manually or head in. I debated for maybe half a minute before stepping through, figuring if there was a breach or forced access, my job was to contain it. The corridor on the other side smelled like chemicals, antiseptic solutions, and something else I couldn't place. Further ahead, there was a corridor branching off to the left labeled Biological Testing Wing. Broken glass crunched under my boots. The lights overhead flickered, giving momentary glimpses of the walls and floor. Discarded lab coats lay in a corner, and a few doors were ajar. I saw flashes of what looked like large transparent canisters, each about the size of a person. They were suspended from the ceiling by metal arms. Their surfaces were scratched from the inside. I crept forward, one hand on my weapon. Without describing the standard pulse-racing sensations, let's just say I was moving with deliberate caution. My mind searched for reasons. Maybe some lab experiments had gone off the rails, or a containment system had failed. Another flicker of light revealed a sign on the wall, H1 and H2 secure area, with an arrow pointing to the left. Ahead, the hallway ended in a wide observation room, separated from the rest by thick glass panels. I remember seeing bloodless footprints across the tile floor. At the far end was a battered door with a small square window. Inside that room I made out stainless steel tables, strapped down restraints, and, well, something that looked half human, half decayed. It was slumped against the far wall. Could have been a test subject, or maybe a figure in a hazmat suit, but the shape was unsettling. Limbs elongated, patches of hair missing. The stench in the air made it clear something was wrong with that body. I listened for any sound. That's when I heard the faint scrape of movement. I angled my flashlight towards the corner of the room. A pair of eyes reflected the beam, milky and unfocused. A figure stood behind one of the overturned tables, then shifted into view. Its clothing was shredded, revealing dull, pallid skin. It staggered forward. At that instant, it let out a rasping exhale that seemed almost mechanical, like air escaping from a broken valve. The term zombie might seem dramatic, but that's exactly where my mind went. I'd heard stories, rumors, pop culture nonsense. I never believed I'd see it in a facility associated with FEMA and the CDC. I backed away. The figure advanced, stuttering in its steps as though it wasn't entirely sure how to walk. Its eyes had a strangely vacant glimmer, not quite alive, but definitely aware of me. The door between us had a crack in the glass. Another wave of stench permeated the room. I wouldn't say it was a strong odor of anything typical, but it carried an unclean heaviness. My throat felt tight. I stepped back into the hallway, deciding I had enough sense not to linger. I saw no sign of other staff. The scientists were gone, and the only living occupant in that wing seemed barely human. I pulled out my radio and tried every channel. "This is Havison. There's something severely wrong in sub-level containment. The door is open. Is anyone reading me?" Nothing but static. Distant rumbles of thunder rolled through the overhead vents. If the entire facility had lost stable power, it meant the negative pressure systems would also be compromised, letting contaminated air escape. That's probably how the infection, or whatever it was, started spreading. I managed to find the corridor leading to the main lab control room. The emergency lighting kept flickering, giving me glimpses of the messy sprawl. Half-eaten MREs, documents scattered, computers with screens cracked. Something big must have happened in a hurry. In the control room, I spotted 3 motionless figures on the floor, each in a lab coat. None were moving. I tried not to fixate on the details of their conditions. On one console, a green light blinked. The label read "Ventilation Override," with a small digital readout that indicated negative pressure had failed. I pressed every button that looked like it might help, but the system seemed locked or offline. One of the monitors flickered to life for a moment, showing a small group of those half-human figures in another part of the facility. They seemed to gather around a door, clawing at it. Then the feed cut out. I found a battered folder on the desk labeled H-type classification. Inside, there were references to test subjects designated as H1 or H2. There were also notes about potential advanced mutations called H3, or hybrid strains. The text described distinct phases of infection, but the pages were torn. One partial line read, "Once reanimated, the subject displays heightened aggression, requiring extensive sedation for transport. Infectious properties remain poorly understood." Infectious. That word rattled in my mind. If these things were out, then we had more than a security breach. We had a catastrophic biological threat. I heard a distant metallic crash from the hallway. My weapon felt slippery in my grip as I gripped it tighter. I left the control room and retraced my steps to the main corridor, trying to find my way back to the big blast door. Possibly I could manually seal it behind me. But as I approached, something lurched out from a side hallway. A figure in a FEMA uniform, but the face was slack, the eyes cloudy. The name patch was spattered with some sort of stain. The figure jerked forward, arms outstretched, as though guided by an instinct to reach me. I didn't want to shoot unless absolutely necessary, but it kept coming. I called out, "Stand down, identify yourself." No response, just that rasping exhale. I noticed a deep scratch running across their forearm, a blackish fluid crusted over it. My mind raced, recalling the term zombie, though we used the word H-type for the infected. People also called them ambulators, haunters, or the rots. But face to face, it was more than just a label. This was a living horror in front of me. I tried one more time to reason with them, but they lunged. I stepped back and ducked into a side corridor. The figure swung an arm, hitting the wall with a dull thud. Realizing there was no negotiation, I raised my sidearm. One shot. The figure staggered but kept moving. Another shot, and it finally slumped. The echo of the discharge reverberated. My ears rang. After a few moments of disoriented silence, I moved past it, turned the corner, and found the main blast door. The opening was wide now, the hydraulic system apparently stuck. So I bolted through, found the external control panel, and forced the manual override. The door groaned, then slowly sealed shut. That might have bought some time. Back on the main floor, the scene was no better. The overhead lights flickered in random patterns. Some corridors were completely dark. Others were lit but strewn with toppled chairs and files. The walls near the elevator shafts had cracks, as if something had slammed against them from the inside. The only good news was that up here, I could sometimes hear my radio picking up faint transmissions. At one junction, I found a reception area where two guards I recognized, Murphy and Delaney, stood in a shaky standoff against half a dozen of those infected. They were calling them walkers. Everybody had a different name for them. No official label had stuck yet. The two guards signaled for me to help. We coordinated quickly, using whatever advantage we could. A corridor choke point. They managed to fend off the shambling group with baton strikes and a few carefully placed shots. When it was over, the infected were down. Without saying a word about the confrontation, Murphy motioned for us to follow him. We needed to get to the front entrance or an emergency exit. Delaney was limping. She'd twisted her ankle in the scuffle. We helped her along, passing dim offices with flickering computers and empty break rooms. Eventually, we reached the main lobby. Large windows along the front, a security checkpoint, and a set of thick double doors that led outside. Wind hammered the glass. Sheets of rain pelted the windows, occasionally lit by flickers of lightning. We tried the doors, but they were electronically locked due to the lockdown. Murphy pried open a panel to manually release them. It took some effort, but he managed to trip the mechanism. A rush of cold wind signaled success. We stepped into the storm and found ourselves in a parking lot turned swamp. Rainwater pooled around the vehicles. Half of them had alarms going off, lights flashing. The perimeter fence was intact, but the main gate was jammed open, possibly from the power surge. A few FEMA transport trucks, parked near the side, sat partially submerged in the swirling water. We decided to make for the trucks, hoping we could drive out. That's when we heard a distant rumbling that wasn't thunder. From the side of the building, an entire group, maybe a dozen or more of those infected, emerged from a loading dock. They lurched forward in a loose pack. Some wore torn lab coats, others were in street clothes, maybe staff that had been staying on site. Their movement was uneven but purposeful, as though they were drawn by our presence. We had no illusions that we could outrun them on foot with Delaney's injury. The trucks were our only option. We hurried through the flooded lot, water splashing around us. The air smelled of ozone and wet metal. Murphy jumped into the driver's seat of the nearest FEMA truck, but the engine sputtered. Delaney and I clambered into the passenger side. She fumbled with a sidearm, checking the magazine as the horde drew closer. Then, on the third try, the engine roared to life. Murphy gunned it, slamming the truck into gear, and we ploughed through standing water. Lightning revealed glimpses of the infected in the side mirrors. They scattered as the truck lurched forward, but a few leaped onto the sideboards, fingers clawing at the windows. Murphy swerved, and the wet road sent us skidding. 2 of them fell away, 1 rolled under the wheels. We pressed on. We hit the access road, a muddy trail leading to a paved route about half a mile away. The truck fishtailed, water and mud splattering across the windshield. I grabbed the radio, scanning for any working channel. That's when I heard a faint voice. Emergency protocols. Outbreak. Quarantine in effect. Evacuation suspended. It sounded like Alvarez, or maybe it was a recorded broadcast. Couldn't tell. The wind outside howled, and the tires kept slipping in the mud. Eventually we reached the paved road. Murphy tried to turn eastward, but the truck slid across wet asphalt. We spun, headlights flashing across the desert plains. The tires lost traction, and the truck veered off the road, plunging into a shallow ditch. The front axle jammed into rocky ground, stopping us cold. Everyone was thrown around in the cabin. Delaney groaned. I forced the door open, ignoring the wail of twisted metal, and stepped out into pelting rain. The truck was stuck. Murphy tried to reverse, but the tires just spun. We saw no sign of the infected in the immediate area, but that didn't mean we were safe. We had to find shelter, wait out the storm, and come up with a new plan. A distant shape took form through the sheets of rain, a small structure about 200 yards off the road. Murphy pointed. We decided to make a run for it, guiding Delaney over the uneven ground. The storm made every step precarious. With each flash of lightning we surveyed the surroundings, expecting to see silhouettes creeping closer, but the desert was mostly empty. The building was an old service shed, maybe once used for road maintenance. The door was partly open, and the interior was dark. We huddled inside using flashlights. An ancient generator sat in one corner, but there was no fuel. We found tarps, a few basic tools, and that was about it. Still, it was dry compared to outside, so we barricaded the door with a metal shelf. Murphy and Delaney tried to rest. I tried the radio again. The channels were a mess of static. Occasionally bits of frantic voices broke through. "They're in the city, CDC directive, infiltration of major highways." Then silence. We spent the rest of the night there, jumpy from every crash of thunder. None of us slept. The wind eventually slowed to a whisper in the early morning hours. When dawn broke, it revealed a soggy desert landscape. The storm had passed, but the sense of devastation lingered. Murphy wanted to head back to the main road, find a working vehicle, and reach the nearest town with a hospital for Delaney. I wanted to attempt a direct call for backup, but with the main facility compromised, I doubted any reinforcements were coming soon. We trudged back to the wrecked FEMA truck, rummaged for supplies. MREs, water canteens, basic medical kits. Delaney's ankle was swollen, but at least it didn't seem broken. She could walk with support. We decided to head southeast toward Bluff, a small town near the Navajo Nation border. If we stuck to Route 163, maybe we'd flag down a passing vehicle or find a gas station. We walked for hours in the drizzle, scanning the horizons. Every so often we'd spot a cluster of old ranch houses or an empty barn. No sign of life. The land was eerily still. By midday, we saw a single sedan parked on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking. Nobody inside. The keys were in the ignition, and the battery was nearly dead. Murphy tried to start it, but no luck. We took a quick look around for cables or a jump, found nothing. We pressed on. Eventually, we reached a small settlement, mostly trailer homes and a local diner, all quiet. The diner's doors were unlocked, but the place was deserted. Tables and chairs were intact. There was a faint smell of coffee long gone cold. We rummaged through the kitchen for anything usable. The power was out, but we found some canned goods and a half-filled propane tank. That's when Delaney noticed a radio behind the diner's counter, an old portable model. She tried a few stations, mostly static. Then we heard a scratched message that repeated, "Emergency alert. A containment breach has occurred in southwestern Utah. All civilians are instructed to avoid contact with subjects exhibiting abnormal aggression or decaying appearance. The National Guard is mobilizing. Remain indoors. Lock and barricade all entrances. Be prepared for further instructions. Murphy and I exchanged a look. At least we knew we weren't alone in this. The government was aware. They were calling them subjects, which matched the hush-hush language at the facility. But hearing it over a public broadcast changed everything. This was out in the open now, no longer contained. Over the next few days, the three of us wandered from place to place, trying to find stable ground. Delaney's ankle improved slightly. We scrounged vehicles when we could, often running out of gas before long. Along the way, we heard people refer to the infected in different ways. H-types, ambulators, the rots, skinwalkers, though that last term has a very different cultural meaning in the region, so it was mostly used by outsiders. Some folks just said zombies, leaning on popular media references. The only consistent thing was that each sighting was worse than the last. In Blanding, a small city near the edge of Bears Ears National Monument, we saw official FEMA tents set up in a parking lot. But they were abandoned. Vehicles were left in haphazard arrangements, some with doors flung wide. Medical cots and IV stands sat waiting. It appeared they'd tried to establish a care facility, but something forced them to leave in a hurry. We didn't see large hordes of infected, not like in big city disaster films, but we saw clusters here and there. They gravitated to any sign of human presence, presumably out of some primal drive. Sometimes we'd see them clustered around vehicles or buildings, as if drawn by an echo of living activity. We avoided them whenever possible. Eventually, we parted ways, and that's where my story diverges from Murphy and Delaney's. Murphy was determined to reach the next major highway, convinced the National Guard or local law enforcement would create roadblocks or safe zones. Delaney wanted proper medical care, though she managed to move on her own. I, however, felt compelled to isolate myself. You might call it paranoia, or an abundance of caution, but I'd seen enough in that facility to suspect I was carrying something. While rummaging in the main lab, I'd come across references to possible aerosol transmission. The short version: if you were exposed inside those sub-level corridors, there was a risk you could develop an infection or mutation over time. I never felt sick in the usual sense. Instead, I had moments where my vision felt sharper than normal, or my hearing picked up high-frequency sounds. I'd catch myself freezing in place whenever I spotted movement, almost like my body was preparing to lunge. It was subtle, but it was there. Maybe it was just the stress, but deep down, I worried I was a walking carrier. I didn't want to end up turning on the people who had helped me. That's why I made a decision to hole up in a remote cabin near Bluff, about a quarter-mile from the San Juan River. It's an old hunting shack, one I'd stumbled across during a training exercise years ago. The owners must have left it behind or rented it out seasonally. Inside, I found dusty bunk beds, a leaky roof, and minimal supplies. But it was shelter, and it was away from population centers. Perfect for laying low while I figured out if I was infected. The first few nights were restless. Wind rattled the corrugated walls, and mice scurried in the corners. The shack had a wood stove with some dry logs stacked outside under a tarp. I made small fires at night, carefully blocking the windows so no smoke or light would betray my location. I set up tripwires around the perimeter with tin cans and scrap wire. I even rigged a makeshift alarm using an old bell I found in the corner of the shack. Every day, I listened to the battery-powered radio, picking up stray broadcasts. Some messages were official. Stay inside. Help will come. Nationwide quarantine. Others were desperate calls from local survivors, describing chaotic scenes in towns I'd visited. There was talk of reinforcements that never arrived. When the storms cleared, the silence of the Utah desert returned. It was an eerie calm, made worse by the knowledge of what was out there. I kept a journal of sorts, scribbling down dates and what little details I remembered from the facility. I tried to recall exact words from that H-type classification folder. Phrases like, rapid tissue necrosis yet maintained mobility, neurological override, inexplicable survival function. Those lines haunted me. If these infected were truly necrotic yet active, then the question was, how did it start? Bioweapon? Some ancient virus? They never let people like me see the big picture. I had enough rations from our scavenging to last a week or two, and the shack's water came from an old well out back. The well water was stale, but it was better than dehydration. On the radio, I sometimes heard repeated emergency alerts describing the spread into Nevada and Arizona. Major highways were blocked. People were warned not to approach large gatherings of these infected. The word zombie finally made it onto a government broadcast, though always couched in disclaimers like colloquially referred to as. The days passed. I began noticing changes in myself. Not overt physical transformations, but a heightened awareness of the night. I'd stand in the doorway of the shack and stare at the tree line, sensing every small rustle or movement. Once, I caught sight of a deer about 100 yards away, calmly grazing among sagebrush. It lifted its head, and for a moment, we locked eyes. It startled and ran. I felt a slight impulse to chase, like a fleeting urge. That was enough to spook me. I reminded myself I was human, not one of those creatures. Sometimes I'd wake with the urge to wander, as though something beyond me was nudging. Other times, I heard faint echoes in my mind of the rasping exhale I'd encountered in the facility. I'd cough into a cloth, checking for any sign of black fluid or something ominous, but nothing. It was just dryness in the air. Still, I worried about some slow, creeping infection. I questioned if every twitch or yawn was the onset of something worse, but day after day, my reasoning stayed intact. I could speak, write, plan. No outward sign of becoming an H-type, so maybe I was safe, or maybe not. One afternoon, I climbed a rocky ridge near the shack to see if I could get a cell phone signal. My phone's battery was almost dead, but I managed to power it on briefly. No bars. I scrolled through old text messages, some from Jaden, who was off at community college in Arizona. The last message from him was days before the meltdown, saying something about midterms. I tried calling but got an error beep. No service. For all I knew, he was safe or he'd evacuated. Possibly he had no idea what was going on. Below the ridge, the desert stretched out in every direction, dotted with scrub. In the distance, I could see a single-lane highway winding toward Monument Valley. No moving vehicles, no signs of active humanity, just the hush of an unsettled land. A few birds circled overhead. I wondered if they too could spread the infection. The documents had mentioned potential cross-species risk, but it was never confirmed. I returned to the shack, searching my memory for what the scientists might have said if they had more time. If this was a slow wave of infection, what came next? Rumors suggested the infected multiplied by passing it on through bites or fluid contact. But it wasn't always immediate, and some infected had no visible injuries. Perhaps it was airborne in enclosed spaces. Perhaps it was something else entirely. With each passing day, the radio broadcasts became less frequent. There were more gaps of static, more abrupt cutoffs. I rarely ventured out. A handful of times I walked to an old hiking trail about a mile away, checking for signs of travelers. Nobody. The wind carried an emptiness over the desert. Twice I heard mechanical rumbling in the distance, maybe trucks or helicopters, but it was too faint to track. No one came looking for me, and I didn't see any roving patrols. It was as if the entire region had been quietly abandoned. One evening, I heard the scuff of footsteps outside the shack. I quickly turned off my lantern. Through a gap in the boarded window, I saw a lone silhouette stumbling along the perimeter. The tripwire cans rattled. The figure paused near the stacked firewood. In the moonlight, I could see torn clothing. The posture was unnatural, shoulders slumped forward, head tilting erratically. Then it let out a ragged exhale and scratched at the side of the shack as though searching for an entry point. My throat felt tight as I clutched my sidearm. The figure circled for a moment, then shuffled away into the darkness. I never opened the door. During long nights by the dim lantern, I mulled over everything I'd witnessed at the FEMA site. The hush-hush nature of it all. The mutated or reanimated figures in the sub-level labs. Those large canisters with scratch marks from the inside. It was clear they'd been experimenting for a while. But why? Maybe it started as research on a rare disease or something gleaned from old pathogens. Perhaps they intended to develop a vaccine for future biological threats. Or darker still, maybe they were looking for a new weapon. People like me weren't given the big picture. A few scrawled notes in my makeshift diary. Project Anstead, official name, or just a cover. H1, H2, initial infected phases, minimal decay, strong aggression. H3, possibly a mutated strain or advanced stage. Hybrid strains, incomplete data, rumored to show cunning or partial intelligence. Transmission, unknown, possibly fluid-based or airborne in specific conditions. I wondered if we'd ever see a cure, or if the word cure even applied. Reanimation implied something beyond normal biology. Maybe the scientists at the site had realized too late that they were dealing with something unstoppable. After about 2 weeks in isolation, the battery in my radio started dying. I saved power by turning it on only at set times, dawn, noon, and dusk. The messages I caught were sporadic, some from far-off stations. Military convoy spotted near Albuquerque, others local. Moab's main road is partially blocked by crashed vehicles. Then more ominously, anyone left in the southwestern region, we advise seeking shelter indefinitely. Do not attempt to travel to Salt Lake City. The city has been declared a restricted zone. Once, near midnight, I caught a faint broadcast from the CDC. The infection is no longer localized. Quarantine measures are in place across multiple states. Citizens are urged to remain indoors. The H-type reanimation phenomenon is under analysis. Continue to follow official guidance. But official guidance was nowhere to be found. There were no supply drops, no rescue teams, no instructions beyond stay put. I realized help might never come. The rest of the country either had bigger problems or had written off this region. That left me alone, with uncertain health and diminishing resources. By now, I'd started noticing subtle changes in my skin, a dryness on my forearms, a pallid tone in certain lights. My eyes felt sensitive after sundown, as if adjusting to darkness with uncanny ease. I caught myself staring too long at nothing in particular, occasionally losing track of time. Was this psychosomatic? Or an early sign that the infection was working its way through my system? Without a lab test or medical help, I had no way to be sure. Sometimes I heard faint echoing sounds in my mind, reminiscent of the moans the infected made in the facility. It rattled my concentration. To keep myself anchored, I wrote more in my journal, describing everything I remembered about my life before. My hometown in Colorado, my parents, my brother Jaden, everything that made me me. I figured if I was changing, if I was slipping away, maybe these words would keep me human, at least on the inside. The real turning point came one evening when I heard multiple vehicles approaching from the highway. It was the first time I'd heard that in days. Engines revving, headlights bobbing across the desert floor. I peeked out a side crack in the wall. There were 3 trucks driving in loose formation. Could have been scavengers, survivors, or maybe some last-ditch rescue team, but my gut told me it was trouble. Usually, large groups in a disaster zone were more concerned with their own survival than helping strangers. Sure enough, one truck circled the area, shining a spotlight on the scrub. They stopped near the shack, close enough that I could hear voices through the night air. Doesn't look like much. Check if there's gear inside. And watch for those freaks. They could be anywhere. I stayed silent, shotgun ready. The front door was barricaded. 2 of them tried to pry it open, mumbling about salvage. One banged on the wall, demanding to be let in. I said nothing. Eventually they spotted my tripwire cans and realized the place was occupied. They tried intimidation, shouting about how they had a right to search for supplies. Then I heard them mention zombie carriers. One threatened to burn the shack if I didn't cooperate. That was my cue. I fired a warning shot through the roof. The sudden crack made them scatter. I shouted, "Move on! I'm alone in here. I've got nothing of value." One voice yelled back, "We'll see about that," but they didn't try to force entry again. The trucks soon revved their engines and drove off. Whether they believed my bluff or decided I wasn't worth the trouble, I'll never know. But it reinforced the reality that civil order had broken down. Survivors were fending for themselves, and suspicion was rampant. If they suspected I was infected, they might have shot me on sight or worse. Every passing day now, I felt the desert world closing in. When I tried to sleep, I'd hear distant howls that might have been coyotes, or might have been something else. Once I glimpsed a small pack of infected shuffling across a dry gulch. They were slow, disoriented, but they moved together like a single searching entity. I stayed hidden on a hillside until they passed. My reflection in the shard of mirror in the shack looked paler. My hair seemed thinner around the temples. The dryness on my forearms had spread. If I pressed a finger into the skin, the imprint lingered too long. I avoided drawing any conclusion, but the signs were all pointing the same direction. I wouldn't say I felt panicked. It was more of an inevitability creeping in. Day after day I told myself, if I'm going to turn, I'll do it out here, away from everyone. That's when I decided to record every detail I could in writing. The entire sequence of events from the FEMA facility meltdown to the wandering in the desert. It became my mission. No matter how bleak the future looked, I wanted people to know what happened. That it wasn't just some random outbreak, but something that started in a secret lab, sealed behind blast doors, financed by who knows which agency. The public had a right to know. And if I was too far gone to share it, maybe someone would find my notes one day. I scrounged any scraps of paper available, including old receipts from a tackle shop. I wrote on the back of them, listing the key points. The sub-level labs at Project Anstead, the sudden storm that killed the power, the partial meltdown and release of H-types, the path I took to escape, along with Murphy and Delaney, my suspicion of carrying the infection, the changes I observed in myself. Every page I completed, I wrapped in plastic and stashed in a metal box I found under the bunk. I placed a weatherproof label on it that read, simply, "For the living." As I write these final entries, the nights have grown colder. My radio is completely dead now. No more voices, no more alerts, no more confirmation that anyone is still out there. I rely on the old wind-up lantern that barely holds a charge. A few times I've considered trekking south to see if I can find the rumored safe zones near the Arizona border. But each time I set out, I sense that I'm not quite right. My coordination wavers. My thought process stutters. At times I catch myself staring into the distance for minutes on end without blinking. It feels as if some intangible line is being crossed within me. I haven't lost my self-awareness yet. I can think, write, reflect on my choices. But how long will that last? In the silent hours, I recall the sight of those blank, cloudy eyes in the facility and wonder if one day I'll look in the mirror and see the same emptiness. Here in the shack, an old calendar on the wall shows November ticking by. No telling what date it really is anymore. Possibly the storms have shifted east. Possibly entire cities have gone quiet. The scale of this outbreak might be beyond imagination. If there's any country left intact, they might just fence off the entire region, leaving us to fend for ourselves. If you're reading or hearing this account, I hope it serves as a warning. I hope you'll believe me enough to stay away from any rumored secret labs or quarantined zones, unless you have a solid plan and proper protection. This started as a covert operation, a FEMA site tucked away in rural Utah. It ended in unleashed chaos, with no easy fix. Though my own future is uncertain, a small part of me still clings to the possibility that someone out there is working on a cure, that one day they'll develop a vaccine or find a method to neutralize these H-types. But if that day never comes, at least let this record stand as evidence of how it began. not with a city overrun overnight, but with a single research station, an outage, and a handful of terrified security contractors discovering something that should never have been created in the first place. I'll keep writing as long as I can. Maybe the slow process I'm experiencing will plateau. Maybe it's not the infection at all, just the psychological toll. I don't know. All I know is that the last time I glimpsed my own eyes in the broken mirror, I thought they looked a shade lighter, and I caught a reflection that wasn't entirely my own. To anyone who stumbles upon this shack, I've left supplies if there are any left. I've left my notes in that metal box. Spread the word if you survive. Let people know that this was real, that it started with the Hush Hush Project Anstead under FEMA's umbrella, and that it spread silently until it was too late to contain. Stay safe out there, if that's even possible anymore. If you see others, help them if you can, but be wary of who, or what, you let inside your walls, because the lines between us and them are blurring faster than anyone can comprehend. For now, I remain in this shack, listening to the desert winds and waiting to see if morning's first light brings any comfort. But comfort is a luxury these days. The reality is far more sobering. It's an emergency alert that no one can turn off, a quiet epidemic that's grown into a monstrous outbreak. And by the time help finally arrives, if it ever does, we might all be something other than human. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.